The first rays of dawn painted Ouagadougou in hues of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the awakening capital of Burkina Faso. In the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré stood at his office window, watching the city come alive. Street. Vendors wheeled their carts through dusty roads, children in crisp school uniforms hurried along sidewalks, and the familiar sounds of morning prayers drifted from nearby mosques. At 35, Ibrahim had grown accustomed to viewing his country, from behind bulletproof glass and through security briefings. Yet something stirred within him this morning, a restlessness that no amount of official documents could satisfy. He had spent the previous evening reviewing healthcare reports, each statistic representing thousands of his people struggling with inadequate medical care. Mr. President, his chief of staff, Mamadou Kone, entered with the day's agenda. Your first meeting is with the Minister of Health at 9, followed by the French ambassador at 10:30, and then cancel them. All, Ibrahim said quietly, still gazing out the window. Mamadou blinked in surprise. Sir? All of them? The ambassador has flown in specifically for... I want to visit Yalgado Ouedraogo National Hospital, Ibrahim interrupted, turning from the window. His eyes held a determination that Mamadou had learned not to question. Today. This morning. Of course, sir. I'll arrange the security detail, notify the hospital administration, prepare the media. No. Ibrahim's voice was gentle but firm. No preparation, no advance notice, no media circus. I want to see the hospital as it truly is, not as they would present it to a president. Mamadou shifted uncomfortably. Sir, security protocols require 2 bodyguards, 1 vehicle. That's all. Ibrahim moved toward his wardrobe, selecting a simple traditional boo-boo in earth tones rather than his usual formal attire. How can I make decisions about healthcare from behind this desk if I don't know how people actually live? An hour later, Ibrahim sat in the back of an unmarked sedan, watching Ouagadougou's morning traffic through tinted windows. His driver, Seydou, a man in his 50s who had served 3 presidents, caught his eye in the rearview mirror. It's been a while since. We've done an unscheduled visit like this, Mr. President, Seydou said with a knowing smile. Too long, Ibrahim replied, adjusting his traditional cap. Sometimes we forget that real leadership means walking among the people, not just governing from above. The hospital came into view, a sprawling complex of concrete buildings, some showing their age with cracked facades and rust stains. Cars, motorcycles, and people on foot created a constant stream of movement around the main entrance. This was the largest public hospital in the country, serving hundreds of thousands of people who couldn't afford private health care. As their car pulled up to the entrance, Ibrahim noticed immediately what the reports hadn't captured: the sheer human density. Families camped outside with their belongings, having traveled from rural areas for treatment. Women nursed babies in whatever shade they could find. Elderly men leaned on walking sticks, their faces etched with worry and fatigue. Sir, are you certain about this? Asked Corporal Sankara, one of his bodyguards, surveying the crowd. More certain than I've been about anything in months, Ibrahim replied, stepping out of the car. The hospital director, Dr. Amadou Sawadogo, nearly dropped his morning coffee when he saw the president of Burkina Faso walking through the main entrance with minimal security. A tall, thin man in his early 60s, Dr. Sawadogo had run the hospital for over a decade and had never experienced such an impromptu presidential visit. Mr. President, he stammered, hurrying forward while still in his white coat. We weren't expecting. I mean, we would have prepared. The ministry didn't inform us. Ibrahim smiled warmly and clasped the doctor's hand. Dr. Sawadogo, that's exactly why I came unannounced. I want to see your hospital as it truly is, not as it would. Be prepared for a state visit. Show me everything, the good, the challenging, all of it. As they walked through the corridors, Ibrahim's trained military eye took in details that statistics couldn't convey. The overcrowded waiting areas where patients sat on plastic chairs, or makeshift bedding on the floor, the persistent smell of disinfectant mixed with human suffering, the nurses who moved with practiced efficiency despite obvious exhaustion. In the general medicine ward, Ibrahim stopped to speak with a young mother holding her fevered child. The woman, Salimata, recognized him immediately, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Mr. President?" she whispered, uncertain if she was dreaming. Ibrahim knelt beside her chair, his voice gentle. "What's your child's name?" "Fatu, sir. She's had a fever for 3 days. We came from Kudugu yesterday." "How long have you been waiting?" Salimata glanced nervously at Dr. Sawadogo before answering. "Since yesterday evening, sir. They say we must wait for blood test results." Ibrahim looked up at the doctor, who shifted uncomfortably. "The laboratory is overwhelmed," Dr. Sawadogo explained, quietly. "We have only 2 functioning machines for the entire hospital." As they continued their tour, Ibrahim encountered similar scenes repeatedly. An elderly man from Bobo Dioulasso, who had been waiting 2 days for a specialist consultation. A pregnant woman who had walked 15 kilometers because the ambulance wasn't available in her district. A child with a broken arm whose parents were trying to scrape together money for X-rays. Each interaction deepened Ibrahim's understanding of the gap between policy and reality. These weren't statistics. They were his people, struggling with a healthcare system that was doing its best with inadequate resources. Dr. Ouattara, the head of pediatrics, joined their group as they entered his department. A man of about 50 with intelligent eyes that showed both compassion and weariness, he had dedicated his career to treating the most vulnerable patients. "Mr. President, would you visit our intensive care unit?" Dr. Ouattara asked. "That's where our most critical cases are, and where we face our greatest challenges." Ibrahim nodded, following the doctor through increasingly narrow hallways. The infrastructure showed its age, paint peeling from walls, ceiling tiles stained from old leaks, floors that had been mopped so many times the original pattern was barely visible. As they turned a corner, Ibrahim stepped into a wet patch where the floor had just been cleaned. His foot slipped, and he had to grab the wall to steady himself. "Be careful, sir. I just mopped there." The voice was soft, apologetic, tinged with embarrassment. Ibrahim turned to see an older woman in a faded blue uniform, holding a mop and bucket. She kept her head down, her posture suggesting years of invisible service. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered. "I should have put up a sign." "No need to apologize," Ibrahim replied kindly. "I should have been watching where I was walking." He was about to continue when something about her voice, her presence, sent an unexpected tremor through him. There was something familiar, something that stirred memories he couldn't quite grasp. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice suddenly urgent despite his attempt to remain calm. The woman looked up slowly, revealing a face marked by age but retaining an underlying gentleness. Her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen much but remained kind. "My name is Aminata, sir. Aminata Ouedraogo." The name hit Ibrahim like a physical force. Aminata. Common enough in Burkina Faso, yet this particular Aminata seemed to unlock something deep in his memory. Fragments of images flashed through his mind. Gentle hands, a soothing voice, the smell of traditional cooking. "Thank you, Aminata," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't explain. Dr. Ouattara, noticing the president's distraction, gently urged him forward. "Shall we continue to the ICU, Mr. President?" But Ibrahim's mind was no longer fully present in the hospital tour. As they moved through the pediatric intensive care unit, where tiny patients fought for their lives with the help of aging equipment, part of his consciousness remained with the cleaning lady named Aminata. Her face, weathered by time but somehow achingly familiar, dominated his thoughts. The remainder of the hospital visit passed in a blur for Ibrahim. He went through the motions, listening to Dr. Ouattara explain the challenges of treating severe malnutrition, nodding as nurses described their struggle with medicine shortages, promising increased government support. But his heart and mind kept returning to Aminata. Several times during the tour, he caught glimpses of her moving quietly through the hallways, cleaning without fanfare, invisible to most, but essential to the hospital's functioning. Each sighting reinforced the strange sense of recognition that he couldn't shake. When Dr. Ouattara led him into the maternity ward, where new mothers lay two to a bed designed for one, Ibrahim made his decision. "Doctor, please continue showing. My chief of staff the facilities," he said quietly. "I need to attend to something important. I'll rejoin you shortly." Before anyone could object, Ibrahim slipped away, following the corridors until he found Aminata in a quiet section near the old wing of the hospital. She was methodically cleaning the floor, her movements economical and practiced. She looked up, startled, when his shadow fell across her work area. "I'm sorry to disturb you again, Aminata," he said gently. "I wonder if I could ask you a few questions." Her hands tightened on the mop handle. "I haven't done anything wrong, Mr. President," she said quickly. "I've worked here for many years, without any problems." "I know you haven't done anything wrong," Ibrahim replied, his tone reassuring. "This isn't about your work. It's personal." He paused, studying her face intently. "How long have you worked at this hospital?" 23 years, sir," she answered, still avoiding direct eye contact. "I started here after I left my village." Ibrahim's pulse quickened. "Which village are you from?" "Koudougou, sir, in the Bulkiemde province." The president felt a mixture of disappointment and confusion. Koudougou wasn't the village he remembered from his childhood. Perhaps his instinct had been wrong. But then Aminata continued. "Though I was born in Koudougou, I lived most of my young adult life in a smaller village called Kouo in the north near Gourma province." Ibrahim's world tilted. Kouo, the village of his earliest memories, the place where his mother had died when he was barely 5 years old. Suddenly, the fragments in his mind began to form a clearer picture. Cooking fires, women singing at a small house where he had felt safe after losing everything. "Do you—" he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember a woman named Fatimata Traoré?" Aminata's entire demeanor changed. Her head snapped up, her eyes searching his face with new intensity. For a long moment, they stared at each other in the hospital corridor, with the sounds of daily medical life continuing around them. "Fatimata," she repeated slowly. "Yes, I knew her. She was your mother." The confirmation hit Ibrahim with unexpected force. "You knew my mother, and you knew me?" Aminata nodded slowly, tears beginning to form at the corners of her eyes. "You were so small when your father died, only 5 years old. I remember you then, curious, always asking questions, following your mother everywhere. But how? Do you remember me so clearly?" A heavy silence fell between them. Hospital life continued its rhythm around them, doctors being paged, families discussing treatment options, the constant hum of medical equipment. But for Ibrahim and Aminata, time seemed suspended. "Perhaps," Aminata said carefully, "this is not the right place for such conversations. There are too many ears, too many eyes." Ibrahim nodded, understanding her discretion. "Where do you live now?" "In Depoya neighborhood, sir. A small house I share with my niece." "I would like to visit you tomorrow," Ibrahim said quietly, "if that would be acceptable to you." Aminata's eyes widened in surprise. "You would come to my house?" "It's very modest, sir. Not suitable for receiving a president." Ibrahim looked directly into her eyes, seeing past the years and the social distance between them. "I wouldn't be coming as a president," he said softly. "I would be coming as that little boy from Kouo, trying to understand his past." That evening, Ibrahim canceled all his appointments and locked himself in his private study. The room, lined with books on political theory, economics, and military strategy, suddenly felt inadequate for the emotional archaeology he needed to undertake. He pulled out a worn photo album that he rarely opened, one of the few possessions that had followed him through his various postings and positions. The photographs were faded, some edges cracked with age, but they held the fragments of his childhood that official biographies couldn't capture. There was his mother, Fatimata, holding the hand of a small boy who barely reached her waist. Her face showed the strength that had sustained her through widowhood and poverty, but also the softness reserved for her only child. There were images of their modest home in Kuo and pictures of village gatherings under the great baobab tree, where elders settled disputes and shared wisdom. But as he searched through the photographs, Aminata's face was nowhere to be found. Had she been so much in the background that even the camera hadn't captured her? Or had his childhood memory created a connection that didn't actually exist? Unable to settle his doubts, Ibrahim picked up his secure phone and called Colonel Diabre, head of his personal security detail. "Colonel, I need you to conduct a discreet background check on someone. Complete confidentiality. No one else is to know about this request." "Of course, Mr. President. What information do you need?" "A woman named Aminata Ouedraogo, approximately 63 years old, works as a cleaner at Yalgado Hospital. She's from Kuo Village, originally. I need everything. Family background, employment history, any connections to the Traoré family." "I'll have the information for you by morning, sir." That night, Ibrahim couldn't sleep. Memories surfaced in waves, some clear, others frustratingly vague. He remembered the devastating loss of his father when he was 4, followed barely a year later by his mother's death from an illness that might have been treatable with better medical care. He recalled the trauma of being taken from everything, familiar to live with his father's relatives in Ouagadougou. But there were other memories, warmer ones, that had always been slightly out of focus. Hands that weren't his mother's but felt equally safe. A voice singing traditional lullabies, the taste of perfectly spiced millet porridge that came from someone who understood exactly how he liked it. Arms that held him when nightmares about losing his parents woke him in the middle of the night. Had those memories been real, or were they the creation of a traumatized child's imagination? Before dawn, he made a decision that surprised even him. He would visit Aminata not as a president conducting official business, but as a man seeking to understand his own history. The file Colonel Diabre delivered was thorough, but revealed little that seemed remarkable on paper. Aminata Ouedraogo, born 1960 in Koudougou, moved to Kuo Village in 1985 after marriage. Widowed in 1994. Moved to Ouagadougou in 2001 and began working at Yalgado Hospital. No children of her own. Clean employment record, no political affiliations. Lived quietly with her niece, Fatou Ouedraogo. What the file couldn't capture was the significance of those dates. Aminata had been in Kuo during the exact period when Ibrahim's mother was dying, and when he, as a traumatized 5-year-old, needed care the most. Ibrahim dressed simply for his visit, traditional clothes that wouldn't draw attention, no official, symbols or insignia. He instructed his driver to use an unmarked vehicle and told his security detail to remain at a distance. "Mr. President, you have a scheduled video conference with the President of Ghana at 11 o'clock, his chief of staff reminded him as he prepared to leave. "Reschedule it," Ibrahim replied without hesitation. "Tell them I have urgent family business to attend to." The drive through Ouagadougou's morning traffic gave him time to prepare mentally for what might be either a reunion with his past or an embarrassing case of mistaken identity. The city awakened around him, vendors setting up stalls, children walking to school, the complex dance of urban life that he usually observed from the isolation of official motorcades. Dapoya was a middle-class neighborhood, neither wealthy nor desperately poor. The houses were modest but well-maintained, with small yards where families grew vegetables and flowers. Clothes hung on lines, and the sounds of daily life, radios playing, women calling to each other, children laughing, created the comfortable cacophony of community. The address led them to a pale yellow house with a corrugated iron roof. A small garden in front showed evidence of careful tending, with marigolds and hibiscus adding color to the modest compound. "I'll go alone," Ibrahim told his security team firmly. "Wait here." The metal gate creaked as he pushed it open. A young woman washing dishes in the yard froze when she saw him, her eyes widening in recognition and disbelief. "Good morning," Ibrahim said gently. "I'm looking for Madame Aminata, the young woman." Who must be Fatou, he realized, silently pointed toward the house, too shocked to speak. Ibrahim knocked softly on the wooden door. "Come in," came the familiar voice he had been hearing in fragments in his dreams. The interior of the house was small but immaculate. Simple furniture arranged with care, colorful traditional fabrics draped over chairs, framed photographs on a modest table, and the smell of incense that spoke of regular prayers. Everything reflected dignity maintained despite modest means. Aminata sat by the window in a wooden chair, and when she looked up at him, Ibrahim knew immediately that his instincts had been correct. Her eyes held recognition, warmth, and something that looked like relief. "I was expecting you," she said calmly, as if a presidential visit were the most natural thing in the world. "I made some tea." They sat facing each other with silence stretching between them like a bridge across 28 years. Outside, the sounds of neighborhood life continued, motorbikes puttering past, children playing, a vendor calling out his wares. But inside the small room, time seemed suspended. "Since yesterday, I haven't been able to stop thinking about our meeting," Ibrahim began carefully. "There was something about you, about your face, that felt like a memory I couldn't quite reach." Aminata poured tea with steady hands, her movements graceful and unhurried. "Children often forget the details of their early years," she said softly. "But sometimes the heart remembers what the mind has lost." She stood and walked to a small wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, she carefully withdrew something wrapped in faded cloth. Returning to her seat, she unwrapped a bracelet made of colorful beads, interspersed with small cowrie shells. "You wore this on your wrist when you were small?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a gift from your mother, Fatimata. She had it blessed by the imam to protect you from harm." Ibrahim took the bracelet with trembling hands. The moment his fingers touched the beads, memories flooded back with startling clarity. He remembered counting those beads when he couldn't sleep, playing with the cowrie shells when he was bored, the comforting weight of the bracelet on his small wrist. "How do you have this?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Aminata took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "When your mother, Fatimata, became very sick, I was her closest neighbor and friend. She asked me to take care of you if something happened to her." She paused, gathering her memories. "For almost 2 years, I cared for you as if you were my own son. I cooked your meals, washed your clothes, told you stories at night when the darkness frightened you. You called me Mama Nina because you couldn't pronounce my full name properly." The memories crashed over Ibrahim like a dam bursting. Mama Nina, warm laughter, strong shoulders that carried him when he was tired, patient hands that taught him to identify different birds, herbal teas that soothed his fevers, and an endless supply of traditional stories that made him feel brave. "I remember you," he whispered, overwhelmed by the power of recovered memory. "I remember you, Mama Nina." Tears flowed freely down Aminata's cheeks. "When your mother died, your uncle came from your father's side of the family. According to tradition, they had the right to take you to the city to live with them. I begged them to let you stay with me, but I was just a woman alone with no official claim on you. Ibrahim knelt before her chair, taking her weathered hands in his. You were my second mother. How could I have ever forgotten you completely? Perhaps the adults thought it would be easier for you to forget village life, to focus on your new opportunities in the city, she replied gently. Memory can be both a blessing and a burden for a child. How did you live all these years? He asked. What happened to you after I left? Aminata smiled sadly. After you were taken away, staying in Kuo became too painful. Everything reminded me of you and your mother. So I left the village and came to Ouagadougou, found work at the hospital, and tried to build a simple life. She gestured toward the photographs on her table. But I never stopped thinking about you. When you began your military career, I followed your progress from afar. When you rose to positions of leadership, I watched with pride, though always from a distance. You should have contacted me, Ibrahim said, his voice filled with regret. You should have come to me. Aminata shook her head gently. And say what? Who would have believed that a cleaning lady from a forgotten village had once cared for the president? The distance between us had grown too great, not just in miles, but in status, in worlds. Ibrahim smiled through his tears. And yet yesterday, fate made me slip on your freshly mopped floor. Allah works in mysterious ways, Aminata replied, her eyes twinkling with gentle humor. Perhaps he decided it was time for the circle to be completed. Time became irrelevant in Aminata's small house. Ibrahim forgot about his presidential duties, his scheduled meetings, and the weight of governing a nation. Here, he was simply a man reconnecting with a fundamental part of his identity. Aminata brought out a small collection of photographs that she had kept hidden in her wooden chest. There was Fatimata, his mother, looking younger than he remembered. There were images of Kuo village as it had been in the 1990s, simpler, more rural, but full of life. And there, in several photographs, was a small boy with serious eyes, sometimes sitting on Aminata's lap, sometimes standing beside her while she worked. Every year, on your birthday, Aminata said softly, I cooked your favorite meal, rice with groundnut sauce and chicken. I would share it with the neighborhood children and say a prayer for your health and happiness. The revelation struck Ibrahim deeply. All these years, someone had been loving him from afar, maintaining a connection he hadn't even known existed. You cared for me even when I was gone, he said, awe evident in his voice. The bonds of love don't break just because of distance, Aminata replied simply. Once someone becomes part of your heart, they remain there always. Fatou, Aminata's niece, who had been quietly observing from the kitchen, finally approached with a tray of food. She served them thick millet porridge with baobab leaf sauce, simple, traditional food that carried the flavors of childhood. Aunt, Aminata often told me stories about you, Fatou said shyly. I thought they were just dreams of an old woman. I never imagined the president would actually come to our house. Aminata smiled warmly at her niece. Fatou is like a daughter to me. Her mother, my sister Kadiatu, died 10 years ago. We take care of each other. Ibrahim turned to Fatou, his expression gentle. Your aunt was like a second mother to me during the most difficult time of my life. Even when I forgot, she never stopped caring. They ate together, sharing stories and memories. Aminata told Ibrahim about his childhood habits, how he had once fallen into a shallow well while chasing a chicken, how he used to crow like a rooster every morning to wake the household, how he insisted on sleeping with a small, blue blanket that had belonged to his father. Each story unlocked more memories for Ibrahim, fragments of his past that he had thought were lost forever. The pain of his parents' deaths had overshadowed many of his early experiences, but Aminata's gentle reminiscences brought back the warmth and love that had also existed during those formative years. Do you remember the story of the clever rabbit? And the lazy hyena? she asked with a mischievous smile. Ibrahim's face lit up immediately. Of course! I used to ask for that story every night, even when I knew it by heart. You would act out all the parts, Aminata laughed. You were particularly good at being the hyena, very dramatic. For the first time in years, Ibrahim laughed, not as a president or a military leader, but as a child remembering pure joy. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Ibrahim began to grasp the full magnitude of what Aminata represented. Here was a woman who had given her heart freely to a child who wasn't biologically hers, who had maintained that love across decades and social distances, and who had never asked for recognition or reward. I want to do something for you, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. You shouldn't have to work at your age. You've given enough of your life to caring for others. Aminata looked at him steadily. Ibrahim, you came back to me. You remembered me. That is already more than I ever dared hope for. No, that's not enough, he said with growing conviction. I owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid, the debt a son owes to his mother. Let me help you now. Let me ensure your comfort and security. And I want to learn more about my childhood, about my mother, about the parts of my history that have been missing. Aminata's eyes softened. If this is truly what you want, I accept your help. But I don't need luxury, Ibrahim. Just enough to live in peace with Fatou, and perhaps to visit Kuo sometimes to feel connected to my roots. Ibrahim nodded, moved by her simple dignity. He stood and pulled her into a warm embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of shea butter and traditional incense that brought back a flood of sensory memories. When he finally prepared to leave, the sun was setting, painting Dapoya in golden light. His security team looked at him with barely concealed anxiety. He had been out of contact for the entire day. Is everything all right, Mr. President? Colonel Sankara asked. Ibrahim paused, looking back at the modest yellow house where Aminata and Fatou waved from the doorway. Better than it's been in years, he said quietly. Today, I found a part of myself that I thought was lost forever. Back at the presidential palace, Ibrahim found his desk covered with urgent files, diplomatic cables, and messages from concerned ministers. His disappearance had caused considerable worry among his staff. But for the first time in his presidency, the business of governing felt secondary to something more fundamental. He had rediscovered the importance of human connections, of recognizing those who nurture and care for others without seeking credit or compensation. That evening, he called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. I want to establish a foundation, he announced without preamble. It will be called Racines du Cœur, Roots of the Heart. Its purpose will be to support women who care for children not their own, who nurture communities from the shadows, who give love without expectation of return. His ministers exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to this unexpected initiative. Mr. President, ventured the Minister of Social Affairs, what prompted this idea? Ibrahim thought carefully before answering. Today I was reminded that the strength of a nation lies not just in its institutions or its economy, but in the countless acts of love and care that happen without fanfare. There are women throughout our country who are raising orphaned children, caring for the elderly, supporting their communities in ways that never make headlines. They deserve recognition and support. Over the following weeks, Ibrahim worked with his team to structure the foundation. It would provide financial assistance, educational opportunities, and healthcare support to women who were caring for vulnerable members of society. But more than that, it would serve as a symbol of national recognition for the invisible work that held communities together. The personal inspiration for the foundation remained private, but Ibrahim had plans for that to change. 3 weeks after his reunion with Aminata, Ibrahim had arranged for her comfortable relocation to a modest but dignified house in a quiet neighborhood of Ouagadougou. He had also secured her early retirement from the hospital with a generous pension that would ensure her security for the rest of her life. The hospital administration had been puzzled by the presidential interest in a cleaning lady, but they processed the request without question. What they didn't understand was that they were facilitating the correction of a decades-old injustice. On a bright Thursday morning, an official car arrived at Aminata's new home. She wore her finest traditional dress, colors vibrant against her gentle frame, but her hands trembled slightly with nervousness. "Where are we going?" she asked the driver quietly. "To the presidential palace, madame," he replied respectfully. "The president is expecting you." At the palace, Aminata's eyes widened in amazement. The grand reception hall was filled with people, government ministers, journalists, traditional chiefs, and faces she recognized from her past. There were people from Kuo village who had made the long journey to the capital. There were colleagues from the hospital where she had worked. Even the old imam who had blessed Ibrahim's protective bracelet all those years ago was present. Ibrahim approached her, his face calm but his eyes reflecting deep emotion. "Don't be afraid, Mama Nina," he said, using the childhood name that only she would understand. "Today is a day of celebration." He guided her to a place of honor at the front of the hall where cameras were recording everything for national television. The story that was about to unfold would touch hearts across the entire nation. "My fellow Burkinabe," Ibrahim began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall and across the airwaves. "I have invited you here today to help me honor a debt, both personal and national." He turned to Aminata, whose eyes glistened with tears of amazement and emotion. "This woman beside me is Aminata Ouedraogo. She was my second mother. When my biological mother Fatimata became critically ill, Aminata took me into her home and cared for me as her own child. She fed me, protected me, loved me, and taught me the values that have guided my life." A murmur of amazement rippled through the audience. This was not the kind of story they expected to hear in a presidential address. "Life separated us when I was taken to live with my father's family in the city. For 28 years, we lost contact. Aminata returned to her work as a cleaner in our national hospital, serving our people with quiet dignity, never asking for recognition or reward." Ibrahim's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Last month, during an unplanned visit to Yalgado Hospital, fate brought us back together. I slipped on a floor she had just mopped. Perhaps Allah's way of ensuring our paths would cross again." Gentle laughter filled the hall as people appreciated the irony and beauty of the moment. For all these years, Aminata worked in our hospital, healing our nation in her own way, not as a doctor, but as someone who maintained the environment where healing could happen. She lived simply, never trading on any connection to me, never seeking anything beyond honest work and honest pay. Ibrahim held up an engraved plaque honoring Aminata's years of service, then presented her with the keys to her new home and the documents securing her lifelong pension. "But today's recognition is not just about Aminata," he continued, his voice rising with passion. "It's about all the women across our nation who raise children not their own, who care for the elderly, who strengthen our communities from the shadows. It's about recognizing that true wealth lies not in gold or political power, but in love given freely and consistently." The applause was thunderous, but Ibrahim wasn't finished. "Therefore, I am pleased to announce the establishment of the Roots of the Heart Foundation. This foundation will support women who, like Aminata, dedicate their lives to nurturing others. It will provide financial assistance, educational opportunities, and healthcare support. But most importantly, it will serve as our nation's recognition that such love is the foundation upon which all progress must be built." He turned to Aminata, who had been listening with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mama Nina, would you like to say a few words?" Aminata stood slowly, overwhelmed by the moment, but drawing on the inner strength that had sustained her through decades of quiet service. "I don't have the words of educated people," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I only know this. Love knows no boundaries. When I cared for little Ibrahim, I never thought about the future. I never imagined he would become our president. I simply loved a child who needed love." She paused, looking out at the assembled crowd with growing confidence. "In our villages, we have a saying, 'It takes an entire village to raise a child.' Every woman who helps raise a child not her own is following this ancient wisdom. I did nothing extraordinary. I only followed the path our ancestors laid down for us." Her gaze returned to Ibrahim, and a radiant smile broke across her weathered face. "I never stopped believing that Allah would let me see my child again. Today my heart overflows with gratitude. May God bless our president, and may God bless our beloved Burkina Faso." The applause that followed was different from the polite clapping typical of official ceremonies. This was heartfelt, emotional, the sound of a nation recognizing something profound about its own values. The story of Ibrahim and Aminata's reunion aired on national television that evening and spread across social media within hours. What had begun as a simple hospital visit had become a powerful symbol of family values, community love, and the importance of honoring those who serve without seeking recognition. In villages across Burkina Faso, families gathered around radios and televisions to hear the story. Elderly women nodded in recognition, remembering their own acts of care for children not biologically their own. Young mothers saw validation for the difficult work of raising children in extended families and communities. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the story resonated throughout Africa and beyond. News outlets picked up the tale of a president who had not forgotten his roots, and of a cleaning lady whose quiet devotion had shaped a nation's leader. Within days, the roots of the Heart Foundation began receiving donations from unexpected sources. Diaspora Burkinabe sent money from France, Canada, and the United States. Other African leaders pledged support. International organizations focused on children's welfare requested meetings to discuss partnerships. But perhaps most significantly, women throughout Burkina Faso began sharing their own stories. Letters poured into the foundation from rural grandmothers raising orphaned grandchildren, from aunts who had taken in their siblings' children after parental death or abandonment, from neighbors who had quietly supported struggling families. Each story reinforced Ibrahim's understanding that Aminata represented not an exception, but a norm. The countless women who held African society together through acts of love that were rarely recognized or rewarded. 1 month after the public ceremony, Ibrahim felt ready for the journey he had been contemplating since his reunion with Aminata. It was time to return to Kuo, the village that had shaped his earliest years, but which he had not visited in over 2 decades. The journey would be both personal and symbolic. As president, his visit would bring attention and resources to a remote area that had been largely forgotten by development programs. As the child who had once lived there, it would represent the completion of a circle that had been broken by tragedy and loss. Aminata accompanied him on the journey, her presence serving as a bridge between his current identity and his childhood memories. They traveled in a modest convoy, no ceremonial motorcade, no elaborate security arrangements, just a practical acknowledgement of the realities of presidential travel in rural Africa. As their vehicles navigated the increasingly rough roads leading to Kuo, Ibrahim watched the landscape change from the bustling urban environment of Ouagadougou to the timeless rhythms of rural life. Farmers worked small plots with hand tools, children herded goats along dusty paths, and women carried water containers balanced perfectly on their heads. "It's smaller than I remembered," Ibrahim said as they approached the village. "Everything seems smaller when we return as adults," Aminata replied gently. "But the important things, the love, the community, the connections, those remain the same size." The village had prepared for their visit. but not with the artificial pomp that often accompanied official visits. Instead, the preparation reflected genuine excitement and pride. Colorful fabric banners hung between trees, traditional drummers waited near the chief's compound, and what seemed like the entire population had gathered to welcome their famous son home. The chief, now an elderly man who had known Ibrahim as a child, stepped forward with dignity befitting the occasion. His traditional robes were ceremonial but worn, speaking of authentic rather than performed tradition. "Welcome home, son of Kuo," the chief said formally. "We have prayed for your return for many years." Ibrahim embraced the chief with genuine warmth. "Thank you for keeping our traditions alive and for keeping the memory of my parents honored." They walked first to the small compound where Ibrahim had lived with his mother, Fatimata. The physical structures had changed. The original buildings had been rebuilt and modified over the years, but the location still held powerful emotional resonance. Standing in the dusty courtyard, Ibrahim could almost hear his mother's voice. Calling him in for meals, could almost see her hanging laundry to dry in the fierce African sun. The memories were no longer painful. Aminata's presence and his own emotional healing had transformed them into treasured connections to his roots. Next, they visited the modest home where Aminata had taken him in after his mother's death. This building had been better maintained, perhaps because it held special significance for the community. An elderly woman emerged from the house, Aminata's cousin, who had stayed in the village all these years. "This is where you slept," she said, pointing to a small room. "Aminata kept your sleeping mat rolled up in the corner for years after you left, hoping you would return." The simple detail moved Ibrahim deeply. Even after he had been taken away, Aminata had maintained hope for his return, had kept physical space for him in her life. Under the great baobab tree where village meetings had been held for generations, Ibrahim sat with the elders and listened to stories of his childhood that he had never heard. Some remembered him as a serious child who asked many questions. Others recalled his love for the traditional stories told during evening gatherings. An elderly woman approached with trembling hands, carrying something wrapped in faded cloth. "You made this yourself when you were small," she said, carefully unwrapping a roughly carved wooden toy, a spinning top that showed the careful but inexpert work of child's hands. "You were so proud of it. I've kept it all these years, hoping someday you would come back." Ibrahim held the toy, spinning it slowly in his palm. Suddenly he was 5 years old again, proud of his creation, showing it off to anyone who would pay attention. The continuity between that child and the man he had become felt complete for the first time in decades. As evening approached, the village gathered for a traditional feast. Long tables appeared under the stars, laden with local specialties: millet couscous, ground nut stew, grilled fish from the nearby river, and vegetables grown in carefully tended gardens. Ibrahim sat between the chief and Aminata, feeling more at peace than he had in years. The conversation flowed in multiple languages: French, Moure, Fulfulde, reflecting the linguistic diversity that was one of Burkina Faso's strengths. A traditional griot took his place near the fire and began to sing the history of the village, weaving in Ibrahim's story as part of the continuing narrative of Kuo. The song spoke of children who left home and became great, but who never forgot their origins. It honored the women who raised children not their own, and the communities that remained strong through mutual support. As the evening progressed, Ibrahim found himself in conversation with young people from the village who saw him as proof that their rural origins need not limit their aspirations. But he was careful to balance that message with respect for those who chose to remain in the village, continuing the agricultural and cultural traditions that sustained the community. "Success isn't just about leaving home and becoming famous," he told a group of teenagers. "Success is also about contributing to your community, caring for others, maintaining the values that make us who we are." Aminata never left Africa, never held political office, never appeared on television until recently. But she has been successful. Every day of her life, because she has lived with purpose, dignity, and love. A young woman in the group raised her hand. Mr. President, what did living with Mama Aminata teach you that helped you become a leader? Ibrahim considered the question carefully. She taught me that real strength comes from serving others, not from being served. She showed me that love doesn't depend on blood relationships, it depends on commitment and care. And she demonstrated that dignity isn't about wealth or status, but about how you treat people and how you fulfill your responsibilities. He paused, looking at Aminata, who was listening with a gentle smile. Most importantly, she taught me that memory is sacred. We have a responsibility to remember those who shaped us, to honor the sacrifices others made for us, and to pass on the love we received to the next generation. As their visit to Kuo drew to a close, Ibrahim announced a series of development initiatives for the region: improved water systems, educational support, healthcare access, and agricultural assistance. But he was careful to frame these as investments in the community's existing strengths rather than charity from an external source. These improvements are not gifts, he explained to the assembled villagers. They are recognition of what this community has already contributed to our nation. You raised a president here, but more importantly, you maintain the values and traditions that are the foundation of our national identity. The announcement was met with enthusiastic approval, but Ibrahim noticed that the villagers seemed most moved by the symbolic recognition rather than the material benefits. Their joy came from feeling seen, remembered, and valued by someone who had risen to national prominence. On their final morning in Kuo, Ibrahim and Aminata sat together on a bench outside the house where he had once lived. The village was awakening. Around them, women going to fetch water, men preparing for work in the fields, children getting ready for school. "Are you at peace with calling me your son now?" Ibrahim asked quietly. Aminata's eyes sparkled with warmth. "You have always been my son, Ibrahim. Distance never changed that, and status never mattered. What happened yesterday was just the world finally recognizing what my heart always knew." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the timeless rhythms of village life continue around them. For Ibrahim, it felt like the final healing of a wound he hadn't fully realized he was carrying, the disconnection from his origins that success and responsibility had gradually created. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and Aminata Ouedraogo became more than news. It became a modern legend that parents told their children, teachers shared in schools, and communities discussed in evening gatherings across West Africa. In Burkina Faso, the tale took on different meanings for different audiences. For children, it was a story about the importance of remembering those who care for you. For adults struggling with poverty, it offered hope that their contributions might someday be recognized. For those in positions of power, it served as a reminder to remain connected to their roots. The roots of the Heart Foundation grew rapidly, supported not only by government funding but by donations from ordinary citizens who saw their own experiences reflected in Aminata's story. Women who had raised nephews and nieces, grandmothers, caring for orphaned grandchildren, neighbors who had taken in abandoned children, all found validation and support through the Foundation's programs. Educational curricula began incorporating the story as an example of African values in practice. University students wrote theses about the sociological implications of recognition and care work. International development organizations studied the Foundation as a model for supporting informal care networks. But perhaps the most significant impact was personal and immediate. Across the country, people began reaching out to those who had shaped their early years: former teachers, extended family members, family friends who had provided support during difficult times. The story had reminded an entire nation of the importance of gratitude and recognition. 2 years later, Aminata Ouedraogo sat in the garden of her comfortable home in Ouagadougou, watching her great-niece Fatu's children play in the afternoon sun. At 65, she had settled into a peaceful retirement, her days filled with Family, friends, and occasional visits from the president she still thought of simply as my son Ibrahim. The roots of the Heart Foundation had evolved into a major national initiative, supporting thousands of women across Burkina Faso and serving as a model for similar programs in other African countries. Aminata served on its advisory board, her practical wisdom helping to guide its development. A journalist visiting for a follow-up story asked her to reflect on how her life had changed since that morning when President Traoré had slipped on her freshly mopped floor. "In some ways, nothing has changed," she replied thoughtfully. "I still wake up grateful for each day. I still care for my family. I still believe in the importance of love and service. The only difference is that now the world knows about it." She paused, watching the children play. But perhaps that's important too. Sometimes we need to be reminded that ordinary love can have extraordinary impact. That the person cleaning your floors or teaching your children or caring for your elderly might be shaping the future in ways we can't imagine. The journalist pressed further. "What do you want people to remember from your story?" Aminata smiled. The same gentle expression that had comforted a frightened 5-year-old boy decades earlier. "I want them to remember that we are all connected, that love creates bonds stronger than blood, and that the threads of memory can weave us back together even after many years apart." She gestured toward the children playing in her garden. "These little ones will grow up knowing they are loved not just by their parents, but by their community. They will understand that success means lifting others up, not just climbing higher yourself. And hopefully, they will remember to honor those who helped them along the way." As the sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Aminata's words carried the wisdom of a woman who had learned that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we give away, and that sometimes, if we are very fortunate, love given freely returns to us multiplied beyond our wildest dreams. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and Aminata Ouedraogo had become more than a personal reunion. It had become a reminder that in a world often focused on individual achievement and material success, the greatest victories are still measured in love given and received, in connections maintained across time and distance, and in the courage to remember and honor those who shaped us when we were most vulnerable. In the end, it was not the power of a presidency that made Ibrahim Traoré's story meaningful. It was the power of a heart that remained open to love, memory, and the sacred bonds that make us truly human. This story serves as a testament to the countless unnamed caregivers, the aunts, grandmothers, neighbors, and family friends, who raise children not their own, who strengthen communities through quiet acts of service, and who deserve our recognition and gratitude. In honoring Aminata, we honor them all.